This is an interview with DaMaris Hill. DaMaris B. Hill is a doctoral student in the English Creative Writing program at the University of Kansas. She is a member of the National Writing Project and graduate of Morgan State University with an MA degree in English. Her story, On the Other Side of Heaven, 1957, won the 2003 Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award for Short Fiction. Eager to express the lives and accomplishments of underrepresented women, she is currently writing a novel about female juvenile delinquents during the Great Depression and working on a chapbook of poetry. The majority of her poetry is spiritually based and addresses issues of gender, race, and identity in a capitalistic society. Her fiction frames issues of race and gender within the context of capitalism and marginalization in various settings around the globe. Some of her writing has been published in the Bermuda Anthology of Poetry, the African American National Biography Project, Warpland, Mourning Katrina, A Poetic Response to Tragedy, Women in Judaism, and the Sable Quill. She recently served as the co-coordinator for the 2008 NWP Professional Writing Retreat anthology. In addition to her graduate studies, she serves as the collections specialist for the project on the history of Black writing at the University of Kansas. I am interviewing DaMaris today, Wednesday, November 18th, 2009, in Lawrence, Kansas. DaMaris, welcome.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much for letting me interview you.
Well, thank you for taking the time to document.
Of course. This is really enjoyable for me. So I came up with a few questions here to ask you today, and we can just sort of use these as a guide, but whatever we want to talk about is just fine. So Are you ready for my first question?
I am ready.
Okay. What was the first book of poetry or poem that you can remember reading?
I remember stealing a book of Nikki Giovanni poetry.
I stole my first one too. That's really funny.
Off of my dad's bookshelf, and Nikki Giovanni was my favorite poet until I came across Lucille Clifton in graduate school.
Wow, that's great. So when, how old were you when you stole that book from your dad's shelf?
Oh my gosh, I was probably like 8 or 9.
It was like for me too. That's really funny for your first book. Do you remember? Do you still have that book, or did you give it back, or what did you?
No, my dad probably has that book. I stole like Soul on Ice later and couldn't really get into it. And they were just Of course, I told you before, but my parents both are ordained ministers now, and I come from a very religious family. So secular books were not really as accessible in my home as they would be in others' homes. There were a lot of books related to theology and philosophy, but not many secular books. I would say like only one bookshelf full of secular books. And so I was very curious about them because they had nothing to do with the Bible.
Yeah. And were they sort of, I'm curious because honestly there are a lot of parallels to what happened with me with finding sort of my first books of poetry too. So were they sort of kept in a room that you didn't have sort of access to, or a different room from the rest of the books, or were they just a separate shelf where the books were kept?
It was just like a separate shelf, and they were somewhat neglected.
Okay.
Also, I didn't really think about it up until now, but we didn't have a stereo in my house for ever. Like, we just didn't play secular music. Music wasn't a big part of my household.
Mm-hmm.
So I think poetry might have been like my way to hear that type of music and melody too.
Oh yeah, like that. That's really interesting. Do you remember when you guys did get a stereo, or was it just?
I just think I wanted a stereo
Mm-hmm.
for Christmas at one point as an adolescent, and that's when another stereo was brought into the house. And when I asked my mother about it, she said she just gave it to her brother when he graduated college, and they didn't have a need for it. I guess they were busy people listening to the radio in the car. I guess they listened to NPR or something. The music was kind of irrelevant.
That's really interesting to me. Just this idea of like
living without music.
Well, in a way of just like sort of like encountering. Well, not that you were only encountering poetry, but sort of like whether it's spiritual literature or whether it was like Nikki Giovanni's poems that sort of coming to sort of melody or rhythm or things like that. Through verse, maybe before, not of course certainly you'd heard music in other places, but just that like that was more present in the home than music, just because it seems like typically you hear people talk about the reverse, like maybe they heard, I don't know, like you hear people talk about encountering certain popular musicians and then they're like, oh, that kind of led me toward poetry, but this is sort of the reverse we're talking about.
Right.
So.
I genuinely had an interest in music, but my parents' reoccurring theme in my household was artist I poor. So when I said I wanted to be a musician, they were like, "Oh, you can play the piano, but artist I poor." So I wasn't really encouraged. The same with visual arts, but reading and writing were things that I can do without ridicule, because they couldn't find out about them.
So were you, if this was sort of an ongoing thing that you heard sort of throughout your childhood, I guess sort of as maybe as a warning, even maybe they'd say, or was that, how did that sort of, did you let your parents know, or how did you let your parents know that you were working on writing?
My parents didn't find out that I was a writer until I won the prize in 2003.
Oh, wow. So did they, and then how did they find it? Did you tell them, or did they just find out through another source?
Them. I was majoring in English. I was successfully teaching then. I went back for my master's. I actually believed, I think around the time that I was writing the story, that I was going to be a cognitive linguist.
Okay.
Even though I did have this passion for writing, I was still very, very intimidated by it, and still believed that artists died poor, and I didn't want to be poor. And I was looking into cognitive linguistics, and finally one of my master's advisors sat me down, and she said, "You have these language courses, and then you have these creative writing courses, and you have to choose."
Oh man, I bet that was a terrifying moment.
I mean, I deliberated for about a month, like as long as I could deliberate. And coincidentally, my first story that I had ever written is the one that won that prize.
That's great. What amazing timing too, just in terms of you trying to make that sort of decision.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a real, that seems really wonderful in a way that's sort of just the time, because you can't control that, the timing of when things get published or issues like that. And then, wow, what an amazing impact. So
yeah, it was a really good year. I told Marita Golden, who is the founder of the Hurston Wright Foundation, actually gave me the prize, and I remember telling her, "I'll be wearing white to the ceremony." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm finally marrying literature here." And she said, "Huh?" She was like so tickled, and I was like, "No, like I'm making a commitment to being a writer. Like this is it. I'm marrying literature here." And I wore a white suit, and I had like a peach blouse. And I encouraged all of my friends to wear like peach or orange.
That's so great. That is so great.
So when people showed up, I was like, "This is my literary wedding."
I think that's so wonderful. I have a question, sort of like keeping in mind the fact that sort of just sort of the circumstances that you described sort of surrounding